August 1944. The Kansas sun blazed over Camp Concordia, its heat shimmering against the endless barbed wire fences and guard towers. Inside the compound, a group of German women prisoners leaned against the barracks window, their eyes fixed on the strangest sight they had yet witnessed in captivity. American guards, laughing and talking among themselves, hovered over open grills. And what they were roasting made the prisoners exchange incredulous glances. Ears of corn, still wrapped in their husks, carefully turned as if they were cuts of precious meat. The golden kernels hissed and popped under the fire, sending out a smoky aroma that drifted through the air. To the Germans it was absurd. Animal feed, one prisoner muttered, her voice sharp with disdain. Another laughed. They're treating pig food like a delicacy. Their tone was mocking, but their unease was real. Months of propaganda had told them Americans were crude, ignorant people with no sense of culture. Yet here, in a place far from Europe, the reality was confusing. The camp was clean. The rations were decent. The guards spoke with unexpected respect. And now, this corn, the food they associated with desperation and livestock, transformed into something celebrated. The women shook their heads, amused and disturbed at the same time. Imagine writing home about this, one of them said. Our families would never believe it. Americans grilling animal feed as if it were fine cuisine. What none of them realized in that moment was how quickly mockery would give way to silence, then surprise, then reluctant admiration. One taste was all it would take to unravel a lifetime of assumptions. Before we continue this extraordinary transformation, make sure to subscribe to Trapped in WW2 and comment where you're watching from. More forgotten stories await you here. Camp Concordia lay sprawled across the Kansas plains, its neat rows of barracks and watchtowers a world away from the devastated streets of wartime Germany. The compound was orderly, almost too orderly, with gravel paths crunching under boots and the faint hum of cicadas hanging in the dry summer air. From the outside it looked like a place of strict discipline. But for the women inside, daily life carried a sense of quiet confusion. Nothing resembled the brutal captivity they had been warned about before surrender. Among them was Helga Richter, once a proud Luftwaffe communications officer. She pressed her palms against the window frame, watching the Americans with narrowed eyes. Her companion, Liesl Mann, leaned close, her expression half curious, half amused. The guards were arranging baskets of corn beside the grills, their laughter floating lightly through the evening air. This proves it, Helga scoffed. They don't know real food. Corn is for pigs, not people. Liesl chuckled, though uneasily. Strange, isn't it? Everything here feels different. They treat us better than we expected. But this. She pointed at the smoking cobs. This is madness. The scene unfolding beyond the wire was surreal. The guards treated the ears with ritualistic care, peeling back husks just enough to char the kernels, brushing them with butter, sprinkling salt. Their actions held the kind of attention Germans reserved for Sunday roasts or special feasts. The smell, sweet, nutty, enticing, drifted across the compound, making some prisoners wrinkle their noses, while others, despite themselves, breathed deeper. Yet to Helga and many others, it was unthinkable. Corn was the food of last resort, used only during shortages, and even then ground into coarse meal to disguise its taste. Seeing it honored on a grill, center stage of what looked like a celebration, was both laughable and unsettling. You know what's worse? Liesl whispered. They look proud of it. As if this peasant food represents America itself. Helga folded her arms. Then America must be as simple as its meals. But deep inside, even as she mocked, an involuntary hunger stirred. The air was heavy with a fragrance unlike the musty barns of home. It was richer, warmer, almost inviting. She pushed the thought away, refusing to let her senses betray her convictions. What Helga and the others could not foresee was how this simple scene, Americans grilling corn on a summer evening, would mark the beginning of a slow unraveling. Before long, the very food they despised would challenge not only their taste buds, but their deepest assumptions about culture, pride, and survival. The German women gathered that evening in the barracks, the air inside thick with dust, sweat, and whispered complaints. 4 weeks they had debated American behavior, each day uncovering some contradiction to the propaganda they had grown up with. The guards were not cruel brutes. The rations were not starvation level. Even the camp itself, though confining, offered far more comfort than the stories of Allied barbarism they had been fed. And yet, the corn, this strange American obsession, felt like proof of something crude, something laughable. Helga's voice carried the sharp authority of her rank. Do not be fooled by their smiles. They serve us decent food because they want us to soften, to forget that we are soldiers. But this nonsense of grilling corn like it is roast goose, only shows their ignorance. They know nothing of real cuisine. Liesl nodded, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of doubt. Perhaps. But still, did you notice the smell? It was not unpleasant. Another prisoner, Greta Schmidt, shook her head firmly. Corn is desperation food. We only touched it in Germany when the potatoes ran out. And even then we ground it to hide its taste. No German family would ever sit together and eat it as a treat. The room filled with murmurs of agreement. They remembered the war years when cornmeal appeared on ration cards, always a mark of scarcity, always associated with shame. Wheat meant bread. Potatoes meant strength. Corn meant hunger. They are a new nation, Helga said, her tone icy. They lack tradition, so they invent it. If corn is what they have, corn is what they celebrate. But that does not make it proper food. Laughter rippled through the barracks, though some of it felt forced. The women were caught between ridicule and curiosity. The scent of roasting corn still lingered in their memories, gnawing at their certainty. Liesl finally broke the silence. What if they invite us to try it? What then? Helga straightened, her eyes narrowing. Then we refuse politely. We will not degrade ourselves with animal feed. Yet even as she spoke, a trace of unease threaded her words. Somewhere deep inside, a question she would never voice pressed at her. Could it really taste as good as it smelled? For now, though, mockery served as armor. To dismiss the Americans was easier than to admit confusion. And so the barracks echoed with scornful jokes, the prisoners reinforcing each other's prejudices, never realizing how quickly those walls of certainty would crumble. In just a few hours, an invitation would arrive, an opportunity they could neither ignore nor easily refuse. The barracks door creaked open just after dusk, and the women stiffened instinctively. Standing in the doorway was Corporal Sarah Mitchell, one of the few female guards assigned to the camp. She carried herself with crisp discipline, though her tone was calm, almost courteous. Fräulein Richter. Fräulein Mann, she called, her German halting but understandable. You are invited to tonight's cultural exchange dinner. The theme is American summer food traditions. Attendance is voluntary, but the kitchen has prepared something special. Her words hung in the air like an accusation. Cultural exchange? Food traditions? The Germans exchanged skeptical glances. Helga raised an eyebrow. Actual food? Or just more animal feed dressed up as cuisine? Mitchell's face betrayed nothing, though her eyes flickered with recognition. She had heard the same remark before many times. With practiced neutrality she answered, "You will have to judge for yourself. Dinner begins at 6 in the recreation hall." When she left, the room erupted with nervous whispers. "We cannot go," Greta declared. "They only want to humiliate us." "But if we refuse," Liesl countered, "they may see it as defiance. And besides, perhaps it would not hurt to be polite." Helga stood silent, her pride warring with her curiosity. Part of her longed to reject the invitation outright. Yet another part, quieter but persistent, wondered what secret these Americans thought worth showing off. Finally she gave her verdict. "We will attend," she said firmly. "Not to eat their pig food but to observe. To witness the bizarre customs they mistake for tradition. And when we return home, we will have stories to tell about how Americans celebrate with livestock fodder." The decision was made. At 6 o'clock, the German women would step into the recreation hall, not knowing that their mocking curiosity was about to collide headlong with surprise, and the first cracks in their certainty would begin to show. The recreation hall buzzed with low conversation as the German women filed in, their expressions a mixture of skepticism and reluctant curiosity. Long tables had been arranged neatly, and outside on the lawn, the grills glowed with steady flames. The air was thick with the sweet, nutty fragrance of roasted corn, mingling with the tang of melting butter. At the center of the gathering stood Sergeant Miller, broad-shouldered, his uniform dusted with smoke from the fire. In careful, accented German he welcomed the prisoners. "Tonight," he announced, "we share with you a tradition. Sweet corn fresh from Kansas farms, grilled with butter and salt. This is summer food in America, family food, celebration food." The Germans shifted uncomfortably. To them, the sight of charred husks and steaming cobs seemed almost theatrical, a parody of cuisine. Yet something in the air stirred their senses, even as pride compelled them to scoff. A tray was brought forward, stacked with ears of corn, golden kernels glistening beneath their blackened husks. Miller peeled one back, steam escaping in a fragrant cloud. He took a bite himself, chewing with relish before holding the ear out toward the prisoners. Who will try first? He asked. The hall grew silent. Dozens of eyes darted toward Helga Richter. As the senior among them, it was unspoken that she should step forward. Some nudged her, others whispered her name. With a sigh of resignation, she rose, her back stiff, her chin lifted in defiance. She approached Miller as though confronting an unexploded shell, her gaze locked on the dripping kernels. He demonstrated again how to eat. Bite directly from cob. The butter and salt bring out sweetness. Sweetness. Helga repeated, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Corn is not sweet. Corn is animal feed. Field corn, yes, Miller replied patiently. But this is sweet corn, different, bred for taste. Helga hesitated. Then, with the solemnity of a soldier carrying out duty, she raised the cob to her lips. Her teeth sank into the kernels. For an instant, her face was unreadable. Then her eyes widened. The flavor was startling, sweet like summer fruit, smoky from the fire, softened by butter, sharpened by salt. It was nothing like the starchy, bland fodder she had known. She chewed slowly, her disbelief evident in every motion. Behind her, the women leaned forward, waiting for her judgment. Finally she spoke, voice hushed but clear. It's not what I expected. It is pleasant. Liesel snatched an ear from the tray, bit into it and gasped. Mein Gott. This tastes nothing like pig food. Within moments, the hall was alive with murmurs, laughter, and the crack of kernels between teeth. Shock gave way to wonder. The wall of prejudice, so carefully built, had been pierced by a single bite. Once the first barrier broke, the atmosphere in the recreation hall shifted completely. What began as cautious sniffs and wary bites turned into a chorus of crunching kernels and startled exclamations. The German women, who only hours earlier had ridiculed the idea of corn as food, now leaned eagerly across the tables, reaching for seconds. Liesel wiped butter from her chin, laughing despite herself. Helga, you mocked them more than anyone, and now look at you. Helga tried to compose her expression, but her second cob betrayed her. I did not expect this, she admitted reluctantly. It is genuinely good. Greta, who had sworn she would never touch animal feed, stared at her half-eaten ear with disbelief. All these years we dismissed this? We fed it to livestock while Americans turned it into something so, she trailed off, searching for the word. So enjoyable. The hall filled with a strange energy, part wonder, part embarrassment. The prisoners exchanged glances that carried unspoken questions. What else have we been wrong about? Sergeant Miller watched with quiet satisfaction. He had seen this reaction before. Sweet corn had a way of defying expectation. To the Germans it was more than a new flavor, it was the unraveling of a certainty, the kind of moment that lodged deep in memory. Helga set her cob down carefully, her voice lower now. If corn can surprise us like this, perhaps we have judged too quickly, not only about food but about much more. Her words settled over the group like a stone dropped into still water. The laughter quieted. Each woman considered what it meant for her to admit that the enemy's food, this simple golden cob, had upended years of belief. The night ended not in mockery, but in silence punctuated by kernels snapping between teeth. It was the sound of pride yielding to curiosity. As the last of the corn was passed around, Sergeant Miller stepped forward again, holding up a half-peeled cob for all to see. His tone was patient, as though he had explained this many times before. You call this animal feed, he said slowly, his German clipped but clear. But you are thinking of field corn, the kind grown in Europe, hard and starchy for grinding into meal or feeding to pigs. That is one kind of corn. He gestured toward the platter, where butter still dripped from golden kernels. This is different. Sweet corn. A variety bred for people, not livestock. It has been part of American farms and kitchens for generations. We grow it because families love it. Because it is worth celebrating. The women exchanged puzzled looks. A variety of corn bred only for taste? The idea seemed absurd, almost extravagant. In Germany, nothing was planted for pleasure, only for necessity. Helga raised her hand slightly, her officer's tone slipping back into place. You mean to say Americans developed entire crops, simply because they were delicious? Miller nodded. Yes. We respect corn as more than survival food. It is part of our culture. Every summer, families gather around grills, eat corn together, laugh together. It is as important to us as bread or potatoes are to you. Greta frowned. But in Germany, corn is poor man's food. No one would waste good soil on it. Then maybe, Miller replied gently, that is why you never discovered its potential. The remark stung, though he had spoken without malice. The Germans fell silent, each woman turning inward, wrestling with the realization that something they had dismissed as inferior might in fact be the foundation of an entirely different tradition. Helga looked again at the cob in her hand, its sweetness still on her tongue. For the first time she wondered not about American ignorance, but about German assumptions. The weeks that followed brought a new rhythm to camp life. The women still wore their uniforms, still marched under watchful eyes, but the tension had softened. The taste of sweet corn lingered in memory, not just on the tongue but in conversation. What had begun as a joke now became a topic of quiet fascination. Some prisoners whispered about how the kernels burst with flavor. Others speculated about why Americans treated corn with such reverence. Then came the announcement. Selected prisoners would be allowed to work temporarily on nearby farms, assisting with the harvest. For most, it was a chance to escape monotony. For Helga Richter, it was more than that. She volunteered without hesitation, her curiosity now impossible to ignore. 2 days later, she rode in the back of a truck with a dozen others, bouncing along dusty Kansas roads. The air smelled of soil and late summer heat. Ahead stretched fields unlike any she had seen in Germany, row after row of tall green stalks, swaying like an endless army. The Schmidt family welcomed them at the gate. Mr. Schmidt, broad-shouldered and sunburned, spoke in accented German. His grandparents had come from Bavaria decades earlier. His wife offered fresh cornbread still warm from the oven. The hospitality startled Helga. Prisoners, yes, but treated as workers even as guests. The farm became her classroom. She learned about varieties of corn, field corn for feed, sweet corn for eating, popcorn for leisure. She studied crop rotation, irrigation, and machinery that cut harvest time to a fraction of what German farms required. Each day revealed something new. You see, Mr. Schmidt explained one morning, leading her between rows heavy with ears, we do not try to make one crop do everything. We specialize. Each variety has its purpose. That is efficiency. Helga touched the kernels thoughtfully. In Germany we plant whatever grows. Wheat for bread. Potatoes for filling the stomach. Corn, only when nothing else will do. Mr. Schmidt shook his head kindly. That is not efficiency. That is stubbornness. You believed corn inferior, so you never asked what it could become. The words unsettled her. Yet as she worked, her doubts grew. Machines roared through fields, turning back-breaking labor into swift harvest. Storage silos kept grain fresh. Families shared meals where sweet corn stood proudly alongside roasts and pies. What Germany mocked, America perfected. One evening, Helga sat on the farmhouse porch, watching the sun sink red over the endless fields. Mrs. Schmidt brought her a plate, grilled corn, buttered, salted, and a wedge of cornbread. My great-grandfather refused corn when he came from Bavaria, she said. Called it pig food. But he learned. He tasted. And it became his favorite. Helga ate quietly, the bread soft and golden, the corn sweet as ever. She thought of her country, of rations and hunger, of pride built on scarcity. She thought of the barracks where she had mocked this very food. Now she sat at an American table, tasting not humiliation but possibility. Every day on the farm chipped away at her certainty. She learned that abundance was not always arrogance, that respect for food could build communities, and that sometimes the enemy's way of life held lessons more valuable than any military victory. By the time the truck carried her back to Camp Concordia, Helga no longer laughed at corn. She carried with her not only the memory of its flavor, but the uneasy awareness that Germany's scorn had blinded them to a crop that could feed nations. The Schmidt farm bustled with unusual excitement as September drew near. The harvest was nearly complete, and with it came an American tradition Helga had never imagined, the community corn roast. Word spread quickly that neighbors from miles around would gather to celebrate, bringing their families, music, and food. To Helga it sounded impossible. In Germany, harvests meant relief from hunger, not celebration. The closest comparison was the solemn Thanksgiving prayers whispered in churches, gratitude for survival rather than joy. But here in Kansas, abundance was not hidden or rationed. It was shared. That evening, the fields glowed under lanterns strung between wooden poles. Long tables sagged under platters of food, pies, roasts, fresh vegetables, and above all, piles of corn ready for the fire. Children darted between the rows, their laughter mingling with fiddle tunes played by a small band near the barn. The air was thick with the scent of roasting corn, smoky and sweet. Mrs. Schmidt pressed a pair of tongs into Helga's hands. You've learned quickly. Tonight, you help us show the others how to do it right. Helga hesitated, startled. Just weeks ago she had ridiculed the very idea of corn as human food. Now she was being asked to demonstrate how to roast it. She took her place by the fire, turning husks, brushing on butter, sprinkling salt. Other prisoners watched with curiosity. One whispered, "2 weeks ago she called it pig food. Now look at her." Helga smiled faintly. "2 weeks ago I was ignorant." As the evening unfolded, she witnessed something remarkable. Farmers and their families ate together with the prisoners, laughter bridging language barriers. No one mocked. No one scowled. They shared food as equals, united by the simple joy of a harvest well earned. She tasted again, kernels bursting with sweetness, mingling with butter and salt. Around her, women who had sworn never to touch corn devoured it with delight, their skepticism dissolving into wonder. It was in that moment Helga understood. This was not just about food. It was about what food represented: abundance, generosity, and community. The enemy had become a teacher, and the lesson was simple yet profound. Scarcity bred pride. Abundance bred humility. As the band played into the night and firelight flickered across faces, Helga realized that corn had done something no lecture, no pamphlet, no guard could ever achieve. It had opened a door in her mind. When Helga returned to Camp Concordia, she was not the same woman who had once mocked the guards at the grill. Something in her posture had changed, less rigid pride, more reflective calm. She carried herself now not only as a prisoner, but as someone who had learned a secret too important to keep. It did not take long before the Americans noticed. One afternoon, Corporal Sarah Mitchell approached her with a curious smile. "You've been helping on the farm. Would you teach the others what you learned?" Helga raised an eyebrow. "Teach them? You mean corn?" Mitchell nodded. "Corn, and how to prepare it. You've seen their resistance. Perhaps they'll listen to you." And so it was that a German officer found herself standing in the camp kitchen, facing a dozen skeptical women. Cast iron skillets gleamed on the stove, sacks of ground cornmeal lined the counter, and the air smelled faintly of butter. Helga folded her arms, meeting their doubtful stares. "2 months ago I would have laughed at this," she admitted. "Cornbread, corn chowder, roasted kernels, I would have called it all pig food. But I was wrong." The room stirred uneasily. Some muttered under their breath. Others crossed their arms tighter. Helga pressed on. "Tonight I will show you how Americans bake cornbread. Not because they are desperate, but because it is delicious, because it is part of their lives." She demonstrated step by step, mixing cornmeal with flour, eggs, and milk, pouring the batter into a hot skillet, sliding it into the oven. As the minutes passed, the kitchen filled with a golden aroma, sweet and buttery, unlike anything the women associated with animal feed. When Helga removed the cornbread, its crust crisp, its interior soft, she cut generous slices and handed them out. Reluctantly, one by one, the women tasted. Greta, who had once declared she would never eat American swine food, chewed slowly, then reached for another piece. This is not bread as we know it," she said. "But it is good. Very good." Laughter rippled through the group, this time not mocking but surprised. The prejudice that had once been so firm began to soften, slice by slice. By evening's end, the kitchen echoed with conversation about recipes, substitutions, and even the possibility of sharing such dishes back home. Helga smiled to herself. She had become what she never imagined, a teacher of corn. Later that night, after the last dishes were washed and the kitchen lanterns dimmed, Helga sat outside beneath the Kansas sky. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of dry grass and distant fields. Around her, the camp was quiet, save for the occasional murmur of guards on patrol. She clasped her hands together, her thoughts restless. The taste of cornbread lingered, but what lingered more was the realization it had brought. Food was not just nourishment, it was culture, identity, even pride. For years she had mocked corn as inferior, not because she had truly known it, but because she had accepted an assumption passed down without question. She recalled her own words in the barracks weeks earlier: "America is simple like its meals." Now she saw how wrong she had been. The simplicity was not ignorance, it was refinement, a mastery of making something humble into something extraordinary. Liesl joined her quietly, sitting on the step beside her. For a while they said nothing. Then Liesl spoke. "If we were wrong about corn," she whispered, "what else were we wrong about?" Helga turned the thought over carefully. The camp's running water, the clean facilities, the efficiency of the farms, all contradicted the images of crude, bumbling Americans painted by German propaganda. Perhaps their greatest mistake had not been military strategy but arrogance. "It is easier to mock," Helga said finally, than to admit ignorance. Corn taught me that. Liesel gave a small, sad smile. Strange, isn't it? That the lesson should come from something so small. Helga gazed at the horizon, where the moonlight touched the endless fields. Sometimes, she said softly, it is the smallest things that expose the biggest lies. The days shortened, and with them came the steady drumbeat of war news. German defeats in the Ardennes, cities reduced to rubble, whispers of surrender. Inside Camp Concordia, life carried on with routines of chores, meals, and guarded freedoms. Yet for Helga, something had quietly shifted. She no longer saw herself simply as a prisoner. She was a witness, carrying knowledge her country had never imagined. One crisp evening, as the harvest season drew to its close, the Schmidt family hosted a farewell meal for the group of prisoners who had worked their farm. Lanterns glowed warmly, casting long shadows across the barnyard, and once again corn roasted over the fire, its fragrance mingling with autumn air. After the meal, Mrs. Schmidt pressed a small cloth packet into Helga's hands. Inside were several pale kernels of dried sweet corn. "For your garden in Germany," she said gently, her German touched with an American accent. "When the war ends, plant these. Show your family what you have learned here." Helga stared at the gift, momentarily speechless. Seeds so ordinary, so small. Yet in them lived something far larger than food. They were a symbol of humility, of lessons learned from unlikely places, of the possibility of change. Liesel leaned close, her voice low. "Do you realize what this means? We return home with more than memories. We return with proof that our certainty was wrong." Helga closed the packet carefully, holding it to her chest. "Yes," she whispered. "These seeds are more than corn. They are reminders. That arrogance blinds us. That wisdom sometimes comes from what we mock. And that if Germany is to rebuild, it must learn not just from its victories, but from its humiliations." She lifted her gaze toward the fields. The war was not over, but she knew that her battle with pride had already been decided. The war ended, and with it came a new reality. Germany lay in ruins, cities bombed, families displaced, hunger gnawing at every doorstep. For Helga, repatriation was not a triumphant return, but a sobering arrival to a homeland that no longer resembled what she had left. The pride of the Reich had collapsed into dust. Yet in her luggage, tucked away in a cloth pouch, lay the gift she carried from Kansas: kernels of sweet corn. Months later, in the shadow of Munich's broken buildings, Helga stood before a small crowd of weary farmers. Her voice was steady, though her heart raced. "This," she said, holding up the dried seeds, "is not the corn you know. It is not the feed you give your livestock. It is sweet corn, food meant for people. In America, it is celebrated, shared, and cherished. And it can be the same here." Skeptical faces stared back at her. An old man muttered, "Corn is animal food." A woman shook her head. "This is propaganda." Helga's lips curved into the faintest smile. "I thought the same once. Until I tasted it." Silence followed. For a moment, she feared rejection. But then she passed the seeds into calloused hands. Curiosity replaced doubt. And with curiosity came hope. Over time, Helga became more than a former officer or a former prisoner. She became a teacher. Demonstration gardens appeared across villages. Farmers learned how to grow, harvest, and prepare sweet corn. Slowly, stubborn prejudice gave way to cautious acceptance. Families who once scorned corn began grilling it in summer yards, baking it into bread, stirring it into soups. Years later, as Helga walked through Munich's bustling market, she saw stalls piled with golden ears, their husks peeled back to show kernels gleaming like treasure. Families bartered, children tugged at their mothers' sleeves, vendors laughed. The sight made her pause, remembering Kansas fields, the Schmidt's kindness, the first bite that had shattered her certainty. She smiled, lifting an ear of corn in her hand. What once symbolized arrogance and mockery now symbolized renewal.